The summer sun burned bright over the rolling Texas plains the day Briar Glen was officially unveiled. Cars lined the streets, balloons floated at the entrance, and children darted between folding chairs where their parents sat fanning themselves with glossy HOA brochures. The scene had the feel of a small-town festival, neighbors shaking hands, real estate agents grinning ear to ear, photographers snapping pictures for the local paper. At the center of it all stood Janice Holloway, president of the brand-new Briar Glen Homeowners Association. Her red suit blazed almost as brightly as the sun, and she stood tall behind the ribbon, scissors poised in hand. To the crowd, she was more than just a leader, she was a builder of dreams, a woman who had turned empty land into a thriving suburban community. When she cut the ribbon and the crowd cheered, Janice let the sound soak in. To her, this was more than a neighborhood, it was her legacy. One day, politicians will talk about how I built this place, she thought. This is proof of what vision and ambition can do. Behind her, rows upon rows of nearly identical homes gleamed in the sunlight. Each two-story house, painted in cheerful pastels with manicured lawns, promised safety, family, and prosperity. There were cul-de-sacs perfect for block parties, a community pool waiting to host birthday gatherings, and even a small playground where toddlers now squealed with delight. On the surface, Briar Glen looked like the picture of success, the American dream in its purest form. But not everyone was swept up in the celebration. At the back of the crowd, Dana Ortiz stood with her husband, clutching a packet of HOA documents. She should have been thrilled. After years of saving, she had finally bought her first home, and her children were already making friends on the playground. Yet unease tugged at her. She had grown up watching her own parents lose a house to foreclosure, and she had promised herself that this time, her family's foundation would be secure. She flipped through the documents again, pausing at the property survey. Something about the lines didn't look right. The house she had purchased seemed to rest on a different parcel than the one listed on her mortgage. When she asked the realtor about it earlier that week, he brushed her off with a smile. Paperwork always looks confusing. Don't worry, title companies check everything. Still, the feeling lingered. Meanwhile, Janice continued her speech from the makeshift stage. She spoke of unity, community, and the promise of generational wealth. She told the residents that Briar Glen wasn't just a neighborhood, but a legacy, one they would pass down to their children and grandchildren. Applause rippled through the crowd. People wanted to believe. What no one saw, not the cheering families, not the smiling realtors, not even Janice herself, was that this celebration marked the beginning of a storm. Because the land beneath Briar Glen was not as empty as Janice believed when she brokered her deals. Somewhere, tucked away from the noise and the balloons, a man still held the deed. His family name was etched on dusty papers stored in a county office, his taxes paid in full, his ownership uncontested. The neighborhood being hailed as a new jewel of Texas suburbs was, in fact, sitting squarely on land that wasn't for sale. For now, though, the crowd laughed and clapped, their voices drowning out the whisper of trouble. Children licked popsicles. Moving trucks unloaded couches. HOA volunteers signed people up for committees. To the families, this was the first day of a brighter future. To Janice, this was proof of her genius. She believed she had outsmarted the doubters and cut every corner cleverly enough to get away with it. But to the man who still owned the soil beneath their feet, this was the beginning of something else entirely. He had watched them build, watched them cheer, and waited. Quietly. Patiently. Because sometimes, the best trap isn't set overnight. Sometimes, you let people walk right into it, one house, one family, one promise at a time. And in Briar Glen, 120 families had just stepped into the biggest legal trap of their lives. Far from the noise of ribbon cuttings and HOA speeches, Calvin Rourke sat on the worn porch of his family's farmhouse. The land stretched out around him in quiet dignity, fields golden under the late afternoon sun. He sipped his coffee slowly, as he had done every evening for years, listening to the cicadas hum. To anyone passing by, Calvin looked like a man who lived a simple life, untouched by the fast pace of the world. His truck was old, his clothes plain, his boots dusty. But beneath that calm exterior was a man who carried history, his family's history, like a torch. Calvin's grandfather had bought this land after returning from World War II, saving every penny from factory work and long nights at the railroad. For a black man in the 1940s, owning land in Texas wasn't just rare, it was revolutionary. It meant security, dignity, and independence in a world designed to strip all three away. Generations of Rourkes had farmed here. Calvin himself had tried his hand at crops and cattle, but times had changed. Farming no longer paid the bills the way it used to. Still, he kept the property taxes paid, the paperwork in order, the deed tucked safely in a fireproof box. His land was his anchor. So when the bulldozers came 2 years ago, Calvin noticed. At first, he thought it was a mistake. Big developers sometimes surveyed nearby acreage, but this was different. Trucks rolled in, men in hard hats drove stakes into his soil, and soon the sound of hammers and saws echoed across the fields. Neighbors told him it was progress, that the city had approved a massive suburban project called Briar Glen. Calvin only nodded, saying little. He never shouted, never protested, never chased the workers off. Instead, he went to the county clerk's office. He pulled his family's deed, traced the lines, matched them to survey maps, and then, patiently, waited. Everyone around him assumed he'd given up. After all, what could one quiet man do against an HOA backed by developers, banks, and politicians? Calvin let them believe it. He knew something they didn't. The law was on his side. His deed was ironclad. His taxes were current. Every house being built was, legally speaking, a house standing on his property. And every dollar that flowed into Briar Glen, mortgages, HOA dues, sales commissions, was tangled in a web of illegitimacy. Calvin could have rushed into court the moment the first house broke ground. But that would have only stalled construction. The developers would have scrambled for permits, maybe offered him a quiet payout, and the community would have carried on. No. Calvin wanted them all in the trap first. He let them build. One house, then 10. Streets paved, playgrounds installed, fences erected. Families arrived with moving trucks, planting flowers in gardens they believed were theirs. He let Janice Holloway stand on that stage and declare herself a visionary. He let the HOA print its glossy newsletters, promising a community for generations. All the while, Calvin documented everything. Photographs. Dates. Witnesses. County filings. Every new nail driven into it was another piece of evidence. Because when the time came, he wouldn't just be one man claiming ownership. He would be the rightful landowner, standing against an entire community that had built their dream on his foundation. And the courts wouldn't see progress, they would see trespass. On that quiet evening, Calvin leaned back in his chair, watching the sunset burn orange across the horizon. From where he sat, he could just barely see the new rooftops of Briar Glen peeking over the treeline. Their windows glowed with the warmth of family dinners, laughter spilling into the twilight. Calvin wasn't cruel. He knew these families hadn't set out to steal from him. They were victims too, unknowing buyers caught in someone else's arrogance. His fight wasn't with them. It was with the HOA. With Janice Holloway. With every person who thought they could erase his family's history with the stroke of a pen. And so, he waited. Because patience was the sharpest weapon he had. The neighborhood might have looked like it belonged to the HOA, but Calvin knew the truth. It was his. And soon, everyone else would know it too. For the first few months, Briar Glen thrived. Children filled the playground, backyard barbecues smoked on weekends, and the HOA newsletters boasted of community spirit. On the surface, it looked like Janice Holloway's grand vision was coming to life. But beneath the cheerful neighborhood facade, small cracks began to appear. It started with Dana Ortiz. One Saturday morning, as she sat at her kitchen table balancing bills, she pulled out her mortgage papers. Something nagged at her. The parcel number listed on her deed didn't match the survey map she had saved from closing day. At first, she thought it was a clerical error. But when she asked her title company about it, the representative grew strangely quiet. "We'll look into it," the woman promised before quickly ending the call. Weeks later, there was still no clear answer. Dana brought it up at the next HOA meeting. "Has anyone else noticed discrepancies in their property lines?" she asked, holding up her paperwork. Janice's smile never wavered, but her eyes hardened. "Dana, this is perfectly normal with new developments. The county adjusts boundaries all the time. Nothing to worry about." The meeting moved on, but a few neighbors exchanged uneasy glances. Dana's question had planted a seed. Around the same time, Martin Wells, a retired Army veteran who had bought one of the corner lots, tried to build a storage shed in his backyard. When he submitted the request to the HOA, they denied it, claiming his yard extended 2 feet into protected community land. Frustrated, Martin pulled the official plat map from the county office. To his surprise, the map didn't even show Briar Glen at all. It still listed the acreage as belonging to one owner, Calvin Rourke. Martin marched into the next board meeting with the map in hand. "Why does the county still show this as private land?" he demanded, slapping the papers onto the table. Janice's face flushed, but she didn't flinch. "The county is behind on its updates," she said smoothly. "Developments move faster than paperwork. Again, nothing to worry about." Some residents nodded, eager to believe her. But others, like Dana, weren't so easily convinced. The whispers spread quickly. At block parties, people spoke in hushed tones about mortgage companies calling them back, asking to review their files. One couple confessed they'd received a strange letter from a lawyer referencing land ownership disputes. Another family noticed construction on their street had suddenly halted, leaving half-finished houses standing like skeletons. The cheerful image of Briar Glen began to erode. Where once neighbors bonded over barbecues, now they huddled in small groups, trading rumors. Words like fraud and lawsuit floated in the air. And through it all, Janice doubled down. She sent out glossy newsletters assuring residents that everything was legally sound. She held barbecues and socials, smiling for photos, brushing off questions. "Don't let fearmongering ruin what we're building," she would say. But privately, even Janice felt the pressure mounting. She had cut corners, yes. She had rushed deals, leaned on friendly county officials, and overlooked certain signatures. But she never imagined someone could actually challenge her. She told herself it would blow over. It always had before. What she didn't realize was that the trap had already been set, and her residents were beginning to notice the bait under their feet. Late one evening, Dana stood on her porch, staring at the streetlights flickering on. Her husband joined her, handing her a cup of tea. "Something's wrong here," Dana whispered. "I can feel it." Her husband tried to reassure her, but Dana couldn't shake the unease. She thought of the way the title clerk had gone silent, of Martin's county map, of the rumors spreading faster each day. And then, she remembered a name she'd overheard at the county office. A quiet man who had once been seen standing by the construction site, watching as the houses rose. Calvin Rourke. The name sat heavy in her mind. She didn't know who he was, but she had the sinking feeling that everyone in Briar Glen was about to find out. The morning it all began, the residents of Briar Glen woke up to something they hadn't expected: silence on their construction sites. For months, the hum of saws and pounding of hammers had been constant, a background rhythm to their new lives. But now the work had stopped. Trucks were gone. Equipment sat abandoned. Half-built homes stood like skeletons at the edges of the development. By noon, word spread, the HOA board had received a notice. A lawsuit. Filed by a man named Calvin Rourke. The documents were precise, devastatingly so. They stated, in no uncertain terms, that the land on which all 120 homes sat was still legally his. He presented decades of deeds, tax receipts, and boundary maps, all meticulously kept. Every word of the filing declared the same truth: Briar Glen had been built on stolen ground. When the news broke, panic exploded. At first, many residents thought it was some sort of scam. "This can't be real," muttered Martin Wells, waving the papers in disbelief. The county would have stopped it. The banks wouldn't have given us loans if this were true. But the more people looked, the harder it was to deny. Title companies went silent. Realtors stopped returning calls. Mortgage officers, once so eager to sell dreams, suddenly had nothing to say. And there, in black and white, was Calvin's name. His family's name. The true owners. The HOA scrambled. Janice Holloway called an emergency meeting at the clubhouse. The room overflowed with furious residents, their voices rising in waves. "What do you mean the land isn't ours?" someone shouted. "Are we going to lose our homes?" cried another. Janice raised her hands, her smile straining under the weight of the chaos. "Everyone, please, calm down. This is just a legal misunderstanding. Some old deed must have slipped through the cracks. We have top lawyers handling it." But even as she spoke, her words sounded hollow. The documents circulating among the residents were too detailed, too official. People weren't just scared, they were angry. "You told us everything was above board." Dana Ortiz's voice cut through the noise. She stood, clutching her papers, her face pale but determined. "You said we were building a legacy. Did you know about this? Did you?" For the first time, Janice faltered. Her smile flickered, her voice stumbled. "Of course not," she said quickly. "These claims are exaggerated. This man, Rourke, he's just trying to cash in." But Dana wasn't convinced. Neither were most of the residents. Across town, Calvin Rourke signed the last of his legal documents with calm precision. His lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Evelyn Grant, slid the papers into a folder. "You're ready for this?" she asked. Calvin nodded once. "Been ready for a long time." He didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. For him, this wasn't about revenge. It was about recognition. His family's land had been taken without so much as a conversation. Now, the courts would have to acknowledge the truth. Evelyn gave him a small smile. "They're not going to see this coming." Calvin leaned back in his chair. "That's the point." By evening, Briar Glen was in full meltdown. Families gathered on porches, clutching their deeds, arguing about what it meant. Some swore it was just a ploy for money. Others feared they'd be evicted, their dreams shattered. Children overheard fragments of conversations and asked questions their parents couldn't answer. The glossy image of a perfect community was unraveling. Trust in the HOA evaporated overnight. Neighbors once united by barbecues now whispered about lawsuits, betrayal, and fraud. And through it all, Janice Holloway's empire, her carefully crafted legacy, was beginning to crumble. What none of them fully realized yet was that this was only the beginning. Calvin hadn't just filed a claim. He had set the stage for a courtroom battle that would pit one man's truth against an entire institution's lies. The trap was sprung. And Briar Glen had walked right into it. The clubhouse had never been so full. Every chair was taken, and still people crowded against the walls, arms crossed, faces drawn tight with fear and fury. The glossy HOA posters, building a legacy together, seemed almost mocking now, fluttering slightly in the air-conditioned hum. Janice Holloway stood at the front, flanked by two board members, trying to project calm. But the room was a storm, and her voice was just another sound drowned in the thunder. "This is under control," she insisted. "Our legal team is confident Mr. Rourke's claim won't hold. You all need to focus on what matters, maintaining the integrity of Briar Glen." The words fell flat. A hand shot up from the crowd, but the speaker didn't wait to be called on. It was Martin Wells, the veteran who had first waved the county map. His voice was sharp as a drill sergeant's. "Integrity? Janice, we built our homes on another man's land. That's not integrity, it's fraud. Either you knew, or you were too careless to find out. Which is it?" Murmurs surged through the crowd, neighbors nodding, whispering. Janice's smile quivered. "No one here has been defrauded. The paperwork simply hasn't caught up. These things happen. Don't lie to us, shouted Dana Ortiz, her voice trembling with both fear and anger. She held up a stack of legal notices that had arrived in her mailbox that morning. We've got letters from attorneys saying our mortgages could be void. If this paperwork doesn't matter, then why are banks calling us nonstop? The room erupted. One resident shouted about retirement savings being tied up in his house. Another cried that her children might lose the only home they'd ever known. A young father stood up and yelled that if the court sided with Calvin, he'd be homeless. Everywhere Janice turned, there were eyes burning into her, demanding answers she didn't have. The revolt spread beyond the clubhouse. In cul-de-sacs where kids once rode bikes, adults now stood in tight circles, comparing documents and trading rumors. I heard Rourke owns every inch, one whispered. They might have to tear the whole place down, said another. Families who had once been friends began to argue. Some demanded the HOA negotiate with Calvin immediately. Others insisted the fight should continue, terrified that any deal would mean paying twice for the same home. Tension seeped into everything. At the community pool, no one swam. At the playground, children played in silence while parents scrolled through their phones, searching for news. The dream of Briar Glen was collapsing under the weight of fear. Meanwhile, Janice locked herself in her office, chain-smoking cigarettes she'd sworn she quit years ago. Every call with the HOA's attorney ended the same way, grim warnings about Calvin's airtight claim. This man waited until the houses were built, one lawyer told her. He has leverage now. He can demand almost anything. Janice slammed her fist on the desk. No! He won't take this from me. I built Briar Glen. I built this community. But even she could feel control slipping through her fingers. Every emergency meeting, every late-night phone call with developers, every attempt to silence the whispers only seemed to fan the flames higher. The residents weren't just angry anymore, they were organizing. Dana started a petition demanding a full audit of the HOA's land purchases. Martin contacted a local reporter, hinting at a scandal brewing in the suburbs. Others whispered about filing their own lawsuits, this time against Janice and the HOA board. Janice had dreamed of being remembered as the woman who created a legacy. Instead, she was becoming the face of betrayal. On a warm evening in late July, as porch lights blinked on across the neighborhood, Dana stood in her driveway and looked out at the rows of houses. They still looked perfect, fresh paint, trimmed lawns, flags fluttering in the breeze. But the illusion was broken. She knew now that these homes weren't built on stability, but on sand. The families of Briar Glen had trusted Janice with their dreams. Now they were ready to tear her down to protect what little security they had left. The revolt had begun, and there was no turning back. The courthouse in downtown Fairview had never seen such a crowd. Reporters clustered on the steps, cameras flashing as residents of Briar Glen shuffled in, their faces tight with dread. On one side sat Calvin Rourke, calm and composed, flanked by his lawyer, Evelyn Grant. On the other, Janice Holloway arrived in a navy suit, her smile brittle as glass, surrounded by the HOA's high-priced attorneys. Inside, the courtroom buzzed like a hive. Neighbors whispered from the benches, clutching papers and phones, some glaring at Calvin, others at Janice. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair named Judge Miriam Collins, called the room to order. This case, she began, will determine whether the subdivision known as Briar Glen was constructed unlawfully on land owned by Mr. Rourke and his family. Let us proceed. Evelyn Grant rose first. She spoke with the measured clarity of someone who had spent years preparing for this moment. Your Honor, this is not a complicated case. My client, Mr. Rourke, is the rightful owner of the 120 acres on which Briar Glen sits. He and his family have held uninterrupted ownership for generations. Here are the deeds, the tax receipts, the boundary surveys, every record meticulously kept. The HOA and developers never contacted him, never purchased the land legally, and never had permission to build. Every home in Briar Glen stands on stolen ground. She stacked thick binders on the table, each marked with years, 1970, 1985, 1999, 2010. Every binder contained proof. The kind of proof no HOA spin could erase. The residents murmured, unease rippling through the benches. Then came Janice's turn. Her lead attorney, a slick man with a polished smile, strode forward. Your Honor, while Mr. Rourke may claim to own this land, the reality is that hundreds of families now live in Briar Glen. These are hard-working people who trusted the system. To disrupt their lives over a technicality would be unjust. Furthermore, we have reason to believe Mr. Rourke deliberately waited until construction was complete to spring this claim, an act of bad faith. Evelyn rose immediately. Objection. Protecting one's legal rights is not bad faith. It is justice. The judge nodded. Sustained. Continue. As the trial unfolded, the trap Calvin had set became clearer with every passing day. Evelyn produced tax receipts proving Calvin had been paying dues on the land even while the HOA was selling lots. She showed letters Calvin had sent years ago, warning the county of errors in their zoning maps, letters that had been ignored. Piece by piece, she dismantled the HOA's credibility. The most devastating blow came when Evelyn called a county surveyor to the stand. The man admitted, under oath, that the county's oversight had failed. The property lines were never cross-checked properly, he confessed, sweat beading on his forehead. Mr. Rourke was right. The entire subdivision sits inside his boundary. The courtroom gasped. Janice's face drained of color. The residents were torn. Some sat in stunned silence, realizing their homes weren't legally theirs. Others wept quietly, children tugging at their sleeves, too young to understand why their parents were breaking. But Calvin remained steady. To him, this was more than a lawsuit, it was vindication. His family's legacy had been trampled, dismissed as worthless. Now the truth was undeniable. When Evelyn finally rested her case, she turned to Calvin and whispered, "They've already lost. It's just a matter of how hard they'll fall." Janice knew it too. Late one night, she sat in her car in the courthouse parking lot, staring at her reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman who looked back at her was not the visionary she once imagined. She was desperate, cornered. The trial wasn't just about land anymore. It was about the collapse of everything she had built, her reputation, her control, her power. And worst of all, she knew it was only the beginning. The judge had yet to issue her ruling. But already, the walls of Briar Glen were cracking. The final day of the trial arrived with heavy skies. Dark clouds rolled above the courthouse, as if nature itself understood that something was about to break. Residents of Briar Glen filled the benches once more, their faces pale with sleepless nights. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Calvin Rourke sat silently at the plaintiff's table, his hands folded neatly, his face unreadable. Across the aisle, Janice Holloway dabbed at her temples with a tissue, whispering frantically with her lawyers. She looked smaller than she ever had, her confidence stripped bare by weeks of relentless testimony. Judge Miriam Collins entered, her black robe flowing as she took her seat. The gavel struck once. This court has reached its decision. A hush fell over the room. Judge Collins began by recounting the evidence. For generations, the Rourke family has maintained legal ownership of the land now known as Briar Glen. Deeds, surveys, and tax records presented in this court confirm their uninterrupted rights to the property. The defendants, the HOA and associated developers, failed to secure legal transfer of said land prior to construction. A low ripple of murmurs spread through the benches. Some residents clutched their spouses' hands tighter. The judge continued, her tone firm but measured. This court recognizes the deep hardship facing the families of Briar Glen. However, the law is clear, one cannot build upon land one does not own. While the residents acted in good faith, the responsibility lies with the HOA board and its leadership, who neglected due diligence and misled their community. Janice's face collapsed. Her lawyers shifted uncomfortably, already anticipating the fallout. Judge Collins' voice cut through the tension like a blade. Therefore, I rule in favor of Mr. Rourke. Ownership of the land remains legally his. The HOA is hereby dissolved, pending further proceedings. Damages and potential remedies for residents will be determined in subsequent hearings. For now, the homes within Briar Glen exist without legal standing. The gavel struck again. Chaos erupted. Residents shouted, some in disbelief, others in rage. "What does this mean for us?" one man bellowed. A woman clutched her head, sobbing uncontrollably. Parents pulled their children close as if the homes they returned to that night might vanish into smoke. Reporters rushed from the room, eager to file headlines that would ripple across the country. Subdivision built on stolen land. Judge sides with original owner. Dana Ortiz, her hands trembling, turned toward Janice. "You did this to us," she hissed. "You sold us lies." Janice tried to answer, but no words came. Her throat was dry, her tongue heavy. For the first time, she saw herself not as the hero of her story, but as the villain in everyone else's. Calvin remained seated, unmoving, while Evelyn Grant packed their files. He hadn't come here to gloat, and he offered no victory speech. When reporters swarmed him at the courthouse steps, shoving microphones in his face, his words were steady. "This land belonged to my family. No one asked. No one offered. They built over us as though we didn't matter. Today, the court recognized the truth. That's all I wanted. It wasn't vengeance, it was justice." Back in Briar Glen that night, the mood was apocalyptic. Porch lights flickered on, but no one laughed on the sidewalks, no one shared drinks on the patios. Instead, clusters of residents argued under the dim glow of street lamps, their voices sharp with blame. Some blamed Janice. Others cursed the county, the banks, even Calvin himself. But deep down, they all knew the truth. They had trusted the wrong people. For Janice, it was the end. The empire she had built on charm and control was gone. Her neighbors now despised her, her name destined to be etched in infamy as the woman who destroyed a community with her ambition. For Calvin, it was only the beginning of deciding what came next. He had won, yes, but what would he do with 120 homes standing on his land? The verdict had been delivered, but the story of Briar Glen was far from over. Briar Glen looked the same from a distance, rows of freshly painted houses, trimmed hedges, and quiet cul-de-sacs. But up close, the illusion had shattered. For sale signs sprouted like weeds. Lawns once lush with pride grew patchy and neglected. Families whispered about moving out, even as others clung desperately to the only homes they had ever known. The HOA, once the ruling voice of the community, was gone. Its signs were ripped down, its office locked, and Janice Holloway had disappeared from public view. Rumors swirled, bankruptcy, lawsuits, even a nervous breakdown. Her empire had collapsed overnight, and with it, the control she wielded. But Calvin Rourke had not disappeared. Weeks after the verdict, Calvin stood at the edge of the land his family had tended for generations. He walked the same ridges his grandfather once plowed, the same trails his father had hunted on. Except now, those ridges and trails were lined with homes, garages, playgrounds. His family's land wasn't fields anymore, it was a suburb. Evelyn Grant, his lawyer, joined him. "The residents are waiting to hear what you'll do," she said quietly. "You have the legal right to evict them all. Developers are making offers too, big offers." Calvin gazed out at the neighborhood. He could hear children's laughter faintly, see bikes scattered on driveways, smell someone grilling burgers. These weren't just houses. They were people's lives. He exhaled slowly. "My father used to say land isn't just dirt. It's memory. They stole ours. But if I throw these people out, I become just like them." Evelyn tilted her head. "So what's your plan?" A week later, Calvin called a meeting at the old clubhouse. Residents packed the room once more, but this time their eyes weren't on Janice, they were on him. He stood at the front, hands steady on the podium. "This land is mine. That's been proven. But I know these houses are your homes. I'm not here to destroy them. Gasps and murmurs spread, hopeful yet cautious. I could evict you. I could sell this land to developers and cash out. But I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm offering a path forward. Each family will have the option to purchase their property directly from me, legally this time. At fair value. No games. No scams. The money will go into a trust in my family's name to honor the legacy that was ignored for so long. The room was silent. Then, slowly, the weight of his words sank in. Relief broke like a wave. Some residents cried, others clapped, others simply sat down and let the tears fall. For the first time in months, hope returned to Briar Glen. Not everyone was happy, of course. Some still blamed Calvin, calling him opportunistic. Others muttered that they shouldn't have to pay again for their homes. But most saw the truth. Calvin could have taken everything. Instead, he gave them a lifeline. Dana Ortiz approached him afterward, her eyes red but her voice steady. "You didn't have to do this," she said. Calvin nodded. "No. But I had to do what was right." Months passed. One by one, families signed new deeds under Calvin's terms. Slowly, the neighborhood stabilized. It wasn't the flawless utopia Janice had promised, it never would be, but it was real, built on truth instead of lies. As for Calvin, he became both a landlord and a symbol. To some, he was a savior. To others, a reminder of the price of blind trust. But to himself, he was simply a man who had defended his family's memory and refused to let greed erase it. On a warm evening, Calvin walked the streets of Briar Glen. Children waved as he passed, neighbors nodded respectfully, and for the first time, the land felt like it carried both his past and their future. The trap had been sprung. Justice had been served. And in the ashes of betrayal, something new, something honest, had taken root.